next guests were participants and organizers of the civil rights movement, which was one of the largest and most successful movements of mass resistance in this nation's history. So, how did they hold together a large, boisterous, and diverse movement of people for over a decade in the face of arrests, violence, and murder, yes, from outside, and many differences of opinion within? And how can these lessons be applied to the Occupy movement? These are some of the questions that we may be considering tonight. All right, our first guest, Carol Ruth Silver, was a freedom rider and was jailed for 40 days. Her diary from that period is being published. Carol Ruth Silver. Yes, come up here, please.
Do I have to use the mic?
I'm not. You can do as you choose.
I don't think I need the mic.
If I help with the it is being video with not so high-tech video, so it's up to you.
Can we make the mic so that it records rather than broadcasts? Oh, that won't help. But, all right. I'm not going to use the mic because I don't need it and you don't need it, and it always makes things more distant between the speaker and the audience when there is an amplification. My name is Carol Ruth Silver. I am here because 50 years ago I was a freedom rider. 50 years ago, in May of 51 years ago, in May of 1961, I was in New York City. I heard in late May about the burning of the bus in Anniston, Alabama, in which people who were black and white together, simply riding on a commercial Greyhound bus through Alabama, were attacked by a mob and an effort made to burn them inside the bus. It wasn't just that they were attacked, it was a murderous attack. It was as murderous and as vicious and as bad as anything that people are now experiencing in places like Syria. And I said to my friends, that's wrong. We should do something about that. And very shortly thereafter, I heard a radio call from James Farmer, the head of CORE, saying, we are asking for volunteers to get on the bus, to go down to Mississippi, to go down to Anniston, Alabama, to continue the freedom rides. And I turned to my friends and I said, well, there's the answer. We gotta go. But it was not easy. And nobody else of my set of friends, black or white, did in fact go. But I felt very strongly, and I also was in the right place at the right time. It was New York City, it was May of 1961. I was winding up my job because in the fall I was going to go to law school, and what could be better for a summer before law school than going to Mississippi and maybe getting killed, or maybe getting arrested and put in jail, which in fact is what did happen. And all of the anxiety, all of the drama was before we got arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. Once we were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, we spent 40 days, and I like to say 40 days and 40 nights, in the Mississippi jails, the Hinds County Jail, the City Jail, and Parchman Penitentiary, which was at that time and still one of the major felony facilities in the country. And those days were filled with boredom, mostly, and singing our songs, some of the kinds of songs that you heard on the recording before we started this, and in telling each other how wonderful we were. Because as we experienced this jail, and as we were able to beat down the jailers, in fact, Mr. Hutchings, the chief jailer at the Hinds County Jail in Jackson, Mississippi, had a heart attack while we were there. And not that we gloated over that, but we really felt success because we hadn't gotten killed yet. And we felt that we had made progress because we were in the newspapers every day. Not that we could see them, but we were told that we were being lauded in the newspapers. So that's why I am a veteran of the civil rights movement. Lots of people call themselves freedom riders, and there's a historical little thing about a freedom rider was a part of that 1961 May through November set of people who rode on public buses mostly into Jackson or Houston or other places. But the much broader, and a lot of people also call freedom riders people who didn't participate in that thing. But we are all veterans of the civil rights movement. And I prefer that term. We are all, whether we picketed in Chicago or in San Francisco, whether we did voter registration in North Carolina, whatever we did, we, the generation of my peers and associates, some of whom are in this room, we did it. We changed the world in a very, very fundamental way. And some of you may know Belva Davis and know her book. She's just written a book called Never in My Wildest Dreams. This is a book about her movement from being an abused child to up through the ranks of television personalities to where she has been and still is in the Bay Area. Well, every time that I think about Barack Obama and the White House and this election that we have now come through a second of, I think never in my wildest dreams in a jailhouse cell in Jackson, Mississippi, did I ever think that I would one day be going to Washington to celebrate the inauguration for the second time of an African-American president of the United States of America. And we have to stop every once in a while and acknowledge and enjoy the victories that we have achieved. And it's not just the freedom riders, it's not just the picketers, it's not only those who actively came out and worked on movement things, it's all the support people who were behind them. It's my mother who, when she heard that I was in jail, not only did she cry and laugh and tell my father that this was outrageous, and how could he have allowed me to do this? But she went every day to the telephone, and in those days, remember this is 1961, to pick up a telephone and make a long distance call, this was a big deal. A big deal. No, that it was expensive, but it also was something you didn't do easily. Every day she went to the telephone and she called the governor's office in Mississippi. She called her senator. She called her representative. And she said, my little girl is in jail in Mississippi. Why are you not getting her out? What are you doing, Mr. Congressman? What are you doing, Mr. Senator, to get my little girl out of jail in Mississippi? And you know what? You multiply that one mother by all the other mothers that were doing something similar, and you have a very, very significant amount of pressure on the mainstream politicians and media. So in answer to the challenge that this group posed when they invited me and some of us other older, what shall I say, senior members of the movement.
But not retired.
But not retired, yes. The challenge was to say, how can the Occupy movement keep our eyes on the prize for the long term? How can the energy and the excitement that came together in Occupy movements in New York and here and all over the country turn to doing something really positive for our country and the world? And if I could offer any one thing, any one piece of advice, it would be to focus. And I know you've heard that before. Occupy has been criticized for being too diffuse and for having every conceivable issue that is an appropriate, that is on the progressive side, represented in its groups. That is okay, because we are all very, very diverse. I have a whole bunch of charitable efforts and activities that I engage in. I won't tell you about my little girls learning on the computer in Afghanistan. I won't tell you about the Chinese American International School in San Francisco, which was the first Mandarin immersion program in the United States. I won't tell you about any of the other stack of requests that I get every day in the postal mail, as well as on email, from organizations that I have supported very diffusely. But when I look at what I have in fact accomplished, when I look at what in fact the presidency of the United States has become because of the election of an African American to that office. And it's not just what he has done, and it's not just the symbolism. It is making it possible for every little African American kid in the blackest part of the ghettos, and I don't mean black in terms of race, but in the worst part of the ghettos of America, every kid now, every little boy anyway, hopefully soon every little girl, is able to say, oh, the president, I saw him, I could be like him, I could be like him, I could be president. If you're 10 years old and you have in your head, I could be somebody, I could be an important person, that is the most important thing that we can give to our kids. the whole notion that life is open to them, that there is a path for them, not the same path. They're not going, probably not going to be the president or even the senator or the representative. But there is a path that could make that happen, like the black guy who was just elected in Nevada. He was a Democrat running in a Republican state. The chances of his winning were like this. And then, what happened? Anybody know what happened? Is the guy who was supposed to win, the Republican candidate, got embroiled in some kind of hanky-panky. And all over the state of Nevada, people were saying, well, I don't know about that. I don't want to vote for him. Who else can I vote for? Well, here's a list of names. Nevada is like 90% white, right? So here's a list of names, and here's Stephen, whatever his name was. And, well, why not him? He's a Democrat. All right, I'll vote for him. And 51.1% of Nevadans voted, or of Nevadans in his district, voted for this guy. And when he showed up and he was black, they were really surprised. But being people of goodwill and hospitality, they invited him in to have a drink, and he put on a cowboy hat and talked very knowledgeably about the big things in Nevada are the wild horse roundup, the wild mustangs that roam the land in Nevada. It's a big deal in Nevada, much bigger than children going to school or whatever. But you have to, if you're going to be a local congressman, you got to know what the local issues are, and he did, and they were all very impressed. So that's what a really open society can do. That's what a really open society, and again, we have to stop for a moment and congratulate ourselves and enjoy these victories. Some are small, some are big, but they're victories. So if Occupy wants to continue to have this diversity, to have this diffused way of operating, the people within Occupy who want to achieve something need to focus on what that something is, not try to bring along everybody in the group, but rather focus on what you can do, or what you can do and want to achieve. You've got to have the objective. You've got to have, this is what I want. If my version of a perfect society were to come about, it would have no dependence on foreign oil, and it would have everybody eating fish. Farm fish, not fish that has been taken from the wild. Everybody has a different view of what would be good for the planet. So that's my objective. The Occupy movement, together with the internet movement, now gives every single one of us a way of connecting with other people who might have the same weird idea. So if my idea is everybody has to eat fish and it shouldn't be farmed, that's not my idea. I mean, that is not something I am pushing for, but I was trying to make up something that was not so far out, but doesn't have an adherent, doesn't have, so far as I know, a bunch of people looking for it. But right now, we are in a place, because of the internet, that gives me, if that was my issue, the ability to go onto any one of a dozen sites and just write a petition that says, I hereby petition somebody. Who do I want to petition? Well, Humboldt County. There's another bastion of white redneck male rights. I shouldn't say that. Some of my best friends are women, strong women in Humboldt County. But we, you and I, any one or two of us, or any one of us, can write one of those petition things and send it out like a little balloon. It goes floating around, and maybe somebody else will pick it up. And that somebody else may be in Greenland, or in France, or in somewhere far away, someone you would never in a million years have come in contact with, because we are earthbound people. But float it out there. Float it out and see if there is anybody else. Now that's one element, and it was very important in the civil rights movement that people express their own ideas and their own way of doing things when we were getting ready to go on some kind of a freedom ride or march or whatever it was. But once the objective had been narrowed down, we are going to cross this bridge in Selma. That's what we're going to do. Then, it was not a time for new ideas. It was a time for discipline. It was a time for hierarchy. It was a time for saying, okay, this minister is going to have 2 vans at this location. Everybody be there. This minister is going to have a food thing at his church. Everybody be there. And you know what? We be there. We went. We accepted that discipline. We accepted the idea that it is not, that there is a time and a place for generating new ideas, and also a time and a place for focusing down on what the task is at hand. So I invite you to consider those things as you move forward with Occupy. And I also think, just to answer a couple of the other questions that were posed, that music was one of the most important threads that kept us together in the civil rights movement. It was the universal language for all of us, and it was symbolic, and it was wonderful. And so music, I'm not sure that I've heard any specifically coming out of Occupy music, but maybe there is some, and it would be good to encourage that. Some good chants.
There's some songs.
I also saw that you wanted to know how were the legislative achievements and their subsequent enforcement accomplished. Legislative achievements, go see Lincoln. Go see Lincoln, and they say that one should never ask to see how sausage is made, nor legislation. Yes. And think of that analogy and watch Lincoln, and you will know that is how the legislative achievements were made. What was the role of the black church? The role of the black church was extremely important in a movement for black equality. It was totally in the interest of the people who were parishioners in that church, but it was not necessarily in the interest of the leaders of the church. Sometimes the leaders of the church were afraid. Sometimes they were afraid physically and of the turmoil, but sometimes they were afraid of being dislodged from their high status, which was based on essentially an ignorance of what other alternatives and what other leadership might be available. So it was not 100%, but it was mostly, like Martin Luther King, who is for real. You know, when somebody is as important and as much lionized as Martin Luther or Martin Luther King or some of these other heroes like Lincoln, you think, well, there must be a wartime. There must be something that they did that was wrong. But, you know, Martin Luther King is one of those few people that had fewer wars than almost anybody that I'm aware of in the public world. So what was the role of the Jewish community? And it is really important at a time when Israel is being attacked in various ways and Jews are being subjected to a new kind of anti-Semitism. It is very important to remember that it was the Jewish community in Jackson, Mississippi, in Anniston, in Birmingham, that stood up, contributed money, sent visitors, sent rabbis to see the very small number of people who were of Jewish faith in the jails because they were religious figures, they were able to get in. It is a very important part, a very important chapter in the civil rights movement that the Jewish community all over the South, where it really counted, as well as with financial contributions from the North, did support the civil rights movement. And I'm very proud of that. I'm a Jew, and I am proud of having been, as a Jew, in the civil rights movement, along with a lot of others. We calculated at one point, just anecdotally, that about 50% of the white civil rights veterans were, in fact, of the Jewish faith. I know one black guy who continually says in speeches that it was 100%, and I say, no, please. I have a lot of Christian friends also. So those are some of the thoughts that come to me in answer to the question, how can Occupy keep our eyes on the prize for the long term? I'm going to stop there and see if anybody wants to ask me questions. I will be glad to answer them, or if you want to move on to the next speaker, we can do that also. Questions? Yes.
John, really appreciate hearing your story. Could you describe just a little more detail on what it was like on the bus, where you went from, who was there,
Okay.
how old people were, what kind of, if you had any attacks or any, what the physical experience was all about?
All right. The Freedom Rides started with about 15 people on a Greyhound bus, or this aspect of the Freedom Ride. And that was the bus that was burned out in Anniston. Those people were then bused to someplace, Birmingham, I think, and then flew on to New Orleans to complete their ride. The rest of us came by bus from starting in New York. I started in New York, other people started in Washington, and we kind of gathered in Atlanta. But by the time that I was there, which was about a week later after the burning of the bus, the federal court had issued an injunction against the Freedom Riders, telling the Freedom Riders that they could not come into Alabama except under pain of being arrested by the federal marshal. So, from Atlanta, my group went a little bit north through Tennessee to Nashville. And in Nashville, we spent time learning about what to do if somebody comes and crashes you on the head and other things like that. We learned the techniques of nonviolent resistance. And then early one morning, myself, 2 white divinity students from Yale University, and 3 black divinity students got on a Trailways bus. Trailways was later bought out by Greyhound, but got on this Trailways bus, and it made a beeline from Nashville directly south to Jackson. And when we got on, the bus driver looked absolutely horrified. He said, I didn't know there were going to be freedom riders, and other words to that effect. But we were very low key. We sat together, but we sat in the back of the bus where other black people were sitting, and we did not get off the bus until actually that's not true. One of the divinity students got off the bus in some little town, and we were afraid that there was going to be a real incident, but the bus driver just kind of grabbed him, threw him back on the bus, and said, we're getting out of here. So that's what happened. There was no attack on me. When I got to Jackson, there was a reporter with his little notebook, and he said, oh, I heard there was a woman on this, a white woman on this ride, but we didn't think she was going to come. And I said, I could have said something really flippant and New York-ish, but I didn't. I held my peace, and I said, well, that wasn't me. And I marched into the colored waiting room, and there I got arrested. Now, I should also say, as some of you know, and somebody may have mentioned, 50 years ago when I got out of jail, I had a sheaf of papers like this in my hand. And for serendipitous reasons, the jailers did not challenge me and make me show them what I had. And what I had was my notes, my diary notes. Now, there were lots of people who went to jail and tried to keep diaries, but most of them lost their paper when they were coming out. So I came out with these sheets of paper and the insides of envelopes and even some clean toilet paper where I had made little notes all for the whole time that I was in jail. And I came out of jail. I went to my mother's house and I said, look what I've got. And she said, well, let's type it up. And for about a week, myself, my 2 sisters, my mother, some other volunteers sat around and typed this up. So now I had a manuscript. And I said to my mother, I was a young woman, do you think we can get this published? And she said, well, maybe. And she said she would make some inquiries. But for 50 years, that manuscript was not published. But last year, at the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides in 2011 in Jackson, Mississippi, I had given a copy of this typed document to hand-typed, no computers in those days, to the Tougaloo College, which is a traditionally black college, had given them a copy of it. And a reporter from the Jackson Times-Picayune saw this in their archives and said to somebody, you ought to publish this. And so here I am sitting in San Francisco, the rides are all over, I'm doing something else, the phone rings, and this soft Mississippi accent says, well, Miss Silver, I understand that you have a diary of your experiences in Mississippi. I won't give his name. I'm from the University Press of Mississippi, and we'd like to look at it. So, fast forward, I am expecting that by September of this year, 2013, that diary will be a real book. I'm sorry,
Yeah, she's correct.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we started the forum is because we want to integrate kind of strategy, short-term, medium-term, long-term strategy into the Occupy movement. And one of the things that I've found has been a real learning experience over the last over a year and 3 months is these divisions that we have. And I've noticed that a lot of times they're along age lines. So we have the young 20-something crew who will only do street action. Then we have the older crew who has the experience but aren't really comfortable being out on the street
anymore.
When we first started the forum, we had it in the park, and I was really pushing for having it in the park to say, let's use our common space. Let's have, use the common space for political discourse. And then other people said, no, because it's too cold, it's too this, it's too that. So we moved to inside. But now when we have it inside, we don't get the young people. When we have it outside, we don't get some other, crew. Last week we had the 20-something crew with us because they were in the forum. This week they scheduled a direct action outside at the same time. And they said, we're not coming because we're sick of talk, we want direct action. So how do we bridge those gaps? And what was it like during the civil rights movement? How did you get the young people not only involved in street action, but involved in planning and strategizing for the long term?
Well, I don't think, the issue that we were involved in was so simple and so direct. It was so, if you'll pardon the pun, black and white. There were no shades of difference. The people from the South sometimes said, well, we can't go so fast. People have to get used to having black people in their restaurants, and then once they had black people in the restaurants, then we can move on to hotels. And the young people generally said, no, that's not what we're interested in. And in fact, most people in the civil rights movement rejected that Southern strategy of going slow. So the objective was never in question. So if you pick an objective, and I'll give you a suggestion of something that I have been working on for a long time, and I won't say as to this one that I'm not totally into it, and that is it's time to stop the war on drugs. It's time to simply say no to the war on drugs. Time to legalize and regulate and tax and let everybody who wants to have any kind of drugs that they want to have them. Because the amount of damage, the number of people that will get killed, or the amount of damage that will be done by that rule is so much less than the amount of damage that's being done with the laws that we have at the present time. Harm reduction, which has been a very important part of the movement to get rid of the drug laws, I think has finally reached a tipping point. I think when the Wall Street Journal, when what's his name, Buffett, Warren Buffett, when the leadership of the not of the progressives, but the leadership of the economy, the leadership of the conservatives, speak out against drug prohibition, hopefully, these people in Washington who have invested so heavily in the war on drugs can be convinced that the time has come to simply stop it. Just say no to drug prohibition. So if you, as Occupy, took that as your one, and I can't conceive of anybody in Occupy who would disagree with that. I cannot conceive of anybody of any smarts that can disagree with that. You can read the book, The New Jim Crow. There's incredible numbers of studies. Portugal has had a very successful experiment now of almost 10 years that is, this is an issue whose time has come, and hopefully it's an issue that just needs a little push from everybody to get us over. So whether that issue or some other issue, pick one issue that everybody in Occupy is going to work on. Then there will be 100 other issues that people want to work on. There'll be this issue and that issue and that issue and this issue. But if you have one issue that everybody commits themselves to work on, maybe it's only 10%, maybe the minimum commitment is 10% of your activist time. Dedicate 10% or more as a condition of being an Occupy person. And, it's like kind of like a dues paying member. You have to pay your dues in coin of the realm. Well, in Occupy, you have to pay your dues by giving 10% of whatever you would otherwise put into activist stuff to that issue. And that's a tipping point issue. That is an issue which could, this year, just happen if everybody got behind it. So I hope that some of you will follow that, and I didn't mean to go on so long. You had another question?
Well, it was similar to hers. Frankly, I don't know if there is one issue that everyone in Occupy can totally agree on, which is why we've broken into smaller groups, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. But I'm really interested in learning from the past, and I have read that even though maybe the civil rights issue wasn't as nuanced as some of the issues we're struggling with now are, nevertheless there were differences, ego clashes, turf scuffles between different people and so forth, as there are with any human gathering of people. And I'm just wondering how that was dealt with, because it seems like it was dealt with reasonably well. The work got done at the end of the day.
Well, I think I addressed that in what I said before. Once a decision was made to do something, it was the discussions were over, the suggestions had all been taken. It was decided, this is what we're going to do today, or for the next week or 10 days or whatever. And everybody fell in line. Everybody said, okay, you do this. Whoever the top of the hierarchy was, whether it was Martin Luther King or Jim Farmer or the women's groups, but somebody stepped up to the plate and said, okay, I will lead this, and I will tell everybody what to do. And if you don't like that, then get yourself another leader. Because there's no glory in leading these things. Believe me, everybody shoots at you, everybody criticizes you. But there is work to be done, and that's the work. The work is hard, the work is tough, nobody appreciates it, but the work of leading toward the good, the better life that we all hope for, that is very satisfying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we also need a volunteer at the door because Bob is taking people who are buzzing in. Said he has to leave at 7, and I don't know if anyone has a cell phone number that they're willing to put on the door outside. Do you have any volunteers?
That's what leadership is about. All right, thank you all very much. One more question. All right, I'll make it short.
Our issue in Occupy Now that's the biggest challenge to us is that we feel, I can pretty much say across the board, that the government is owned, corrupt, and not necessarily the place to make an appeal or to make demands. And so what we're trying to figure out is where do you put the pressure down? And how did you figure that out? Where you put the pressure to make a change?
We had no question as to where the pressure had to be put and where the changes could come from. So to the extent that I don't want to be heard to agree with that analysis. I don't at all agree with that analysis. But I think that it is important for you to work out what your analysis is. And again, I would recommend that you look at these internet petition things. They are quite effective in some ways, and you might very well find that as a way of clarifying what can be done. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, everybody. Well, the sign-up sheet's going around for the Fishtarian Working Group. And, okay, so our next guest is Phil Hutchings. Please forgive me if I mispronounce the name. Phil Hutchings was a long-term civil rights organizer and the 1968 chair of SNCC, which stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Wanted to say one thing about Ruth Silver. One of the things she did after the civil rights movement was that she became a supervisor here in San Francisco. All right. So she was part of the city government for a while. I'm going to sit down, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really nice about the 60s and the civil rights movement is we kind of made our own rules. And so we wanted to sit, we sat, and we tried to change things around. In fact, we felt a little bored if we hadn't changed a few things around. And part of that was about being rebellious. I think that one of the quotes I always loved that kind of explained the 60s was by Mao Zedong. And he said very simply, it is right to rebel. And I think more than any other single quote that symbolized the 60s and all the different movements that happened. And that's just not protest. That's actually rebelling, because we were interested in not just protesting this and protesting that, we were interested in going beyond that. And so the rebellion was to basically create something new, and basically where possible to knock down the old structures, like Jim Crow segregation, etc. Let me backtrack a minute. My name is Phil Hutchings. I live in Oakland, and I've been out here for about 35 years. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, where I first, as a young person in high school, got involved with the youth chapter of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And then I went to college at Howard University in Washington, where I first met people who were actually involved day to day in the civil rights movement. What was really a mind, excuse the expression, a mind fuck for me, was that most of these people were younger. These were high school students. And in Northern Virginia, parts of Maryland that surrounded Washington, D.C., which were mostly at that time still officially legally segregated. First time I ever got arrested was in 1961 in Baltimore, in the city of Baltimore. And the city of Baltimore was entirely segregated. And this was at a coffee shop and restaurant. So it was very pervasive all over. We didn't have to go look for it in Mississippi. We did get to Mississippi and Alabama and other places, but it was very much all around. That's the point I'm trying to make here. And so it was a continuing education for me all the time I was there, because I kept meeting new and new people who were involved in different aspects and who were finding new ways to struggle against some of the old 1950s. We were going from the 1950s, the Cold War, the McCarthy era, all these things, into something new. We weren't quite sure what it was. But basically, people wanted something new and different. And for a brief period of time, that was symbolized by this new young president, a guy named John Kennedy, who unfortunately would get assassinated, murdered in '63. But he basically, well, who knows? But basically, in many ways, symbolized a new generation was basically coming in to take over and kind of redefine the political, social, economic reality of the country. So, what I did in SNCC, let me just say what I did in SNCC. I got totally attracted at SNCC at Howard University, where a lot of people would come up who were students full-time at Howard, and then they'd go, in the summertime, they'd go to Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Southwest Georgia, or someplace, then they'd come back to school in the fall. Some people got so entrenched, they just dropped out of school, which is what I eventually did myself. I dropped out for 11 years. I always say it took me 15 years to get a BA, because I just dropped out. I was learning more in the real world than I was at Howard University. And that's true in so many different places. So I basically worked in the civil rights movement through the early mid-60s. In the late 60s, because I'm a northern boy, I wanted to see what was happening in the north. And I always felt to a certain degree what we were doing, where we were successful, was making particularly the urban south like the urban north. And coming out of a place like Cleveland, having relatives in New York and other places, I knew that the urban north around racial issues was not totally, and certainly economic issues, was not great either. So then we had to do something more. So I joined a group called the Newark Community Union Project in Newark, New Jersey, doing work in what gets called the ghetto areas. Met this guy, David Hartsough, in 1965, and known him for half my life before. And so it was the first time that I got a chance to use some of the techniques of organizing that we had worked in SNCC in the South into a different situation, which was faster paced, people were more mobile, there was not so much outright physical segregation, like legal, as there was in the South, and do that in the North. From that time, after that I went to to Detroit in the 70s when Detroit was Murder City. I worked in an alternative high school, and I did work with youth, and particularly around the drug issue, which was getting very big, because a lot of the parts of the murder rate were connected, of course, with the drug rate, and it's still true, even here today in Oakland, where I live now. And then I moved out here in '77 and got involved in the anti-Bakke campaign around affirmative action. Bakke was up at UC Davis, and because it was a national issue, we were able to do a lot of work. I was able to meet a lot of people all over California and span that bay between Oakland and San Francisco. And so it was a real learning process for me to do that. So the civil rights movement basically changed my life, who I was going to be. My father was a postal clerk. My mother would become a social worker in Cleveland. But I was basically programmed to be an upcoming black, middle class professional who hopefully would marry a nice girl who was in a sorority, and I would join a fraternity, and we'd live happily ever after, have 2.3-point kids and a dog and a white picket fence, and maybe move out into the suburbs. That was the the plan. Of course, I was gone by 1962, after 2 years of being in the military. My mother said to me, she says, Philip, she had the three things, don't do. She says, don't get any girl pregnant, don't become a drug addict and waste your life on drugs, and don't become a communist. So, I said 2 out of 3 is out there. So that's what I tried to do. So I want to say I feel really good to be here today. I recognize a few faces in the room. I actually lived here in San Francisco for 11 years in the mission on near 22nd in Valencia between 1982 and 1993. I worked for a now defunct foundation called the Vanguard Foundation, and which some people probably have heard about. And kind of was leaving town just as the kind of the anti-gentrification movement was happening, particularly in the mission. And that's a whole other story, but that was about how economics and race came together in the 80s and 90s, and in some ways it's still happening here in San Francisco. Not to mention that it's not happening in Oakland. It is. So that's a little bit of my story in terms of involvement, and by and large I've been involved in mostly issues around the community, which is what I got from being a SNCC, starting at the grassroots, working with average people, trying not to give speeches, but to have conversations, not always possible, but try to. I like to sit down. Somehow when I feel I'm standing up, I'm giving a speech. And not that there's not a place for speech, but part of what is involved in community organizing is creating relationships among people. And you've got to be able to hear that on both sides, both talk and listen. And Ruth Silver was talking about leaders, which is very important. One of the things that we also tried to pioneer a little bit about in SNCC was the concept of becoming followers. Because leaders in organizations need followers. And people become better leaders in the long run by being followers, because you have a sense at the very grassroots level how organizations work, how what the average day-to-day grunt work of an organization is, and you have some effect because you've done it yourself, and that you basically follow people. And now, if you get moved into a leadership position, you have a sense of how people will want to follow you, or how you'd like to have people follow you. In fact, one of the rules that I had as a young pup in SNCC was that I didn't have any great respect for any so-called leader who would not tolerate a, quote, silly question from me. And if they didn't have time to sit down for me and talk a little bit, maybe not every single second, I mean, people were busy, but is that somebody, I could come up to you in the evening and say, hey, tell me about what happened here 20 years ago, or what happened to the, how did the farm workers happen before the 60s in Mississippi? And it's just part of my learning process. There were no books on that. And so if leaders didn't have time to answer those kinds of questions and deal with the people who they're working with who are not the leaders, it made me have real questions from the very jump about what kind of leaders we were. And I think it's a very good practice even yet today, regardless of what movement you're in and so on. One thing I forgot to say, which is really weird given this setting, I guess for about a year and a half I was also actively involved in Occupy Oakland. And I worked in downtown Oakland, so literally almost every day I was right across the street from 14th and Broadway and bring lunch, and after work around 5 o'clock when they had the general assembly, I'd walk over to Occupy Oakland and see some of the give and take, and I had my little time trying to give advice, and sometimes get listened to, and sometimes get shined on. And it was fine either way, it's not over. And one of the greatest days I ever experienced, and maybe some of you were there too, was back in October when we went and took the Port of Oakland and closed the Port of Oakland. That was one of the, I mean, civil rights movement, everything, that was one of the greatest days this period. So, let me say, what was SNCC? SNCC was a bunch of kind of unruly college, high school, some people who were in their 30s and 40s who had dropped out at the beginning and for a long time, predominantly black and white, and some with college education, some with very little education. And there was room for that in the organization, particularly when we were working in real rural communities, predominantly in Mississippi, Southwest Georgia, and Alabama, and sometimes parts of Arkansas as well. Wish we had met Bill Clinton beforehand. We could have done a little political education years in advance. But we were a very, it was like herding cats, literally. And when I went to a meeting of the General Assemblies in Oakland, I said, oh yeah, I know what it's all about, yeah. I mean, we'd have meetings, sometimes it would go overnight, a couple of days, especially if there was some big decision of something that had to be made. And, but you know, we called ourselves, and we were a little bit, on the gender side, a little slow on this. We called ourselves a band of brothers and a circle of trust. I mean, that there were brothers and sisters, and we felt that we were basically involved in the struggle. And that it took us a long time to make a decision on key matters, but when we did, generally people upheld that. And the two things that I think distinguished it in some ways were that it was an organization geared around nonviolence. And let me try and qualify that a little bit, is that there is what's called philosophical nonviolence and strategic nonviolence. And by and large, most of the people, with significant exceptions, were probably in it for the tactical nonviolence and strategic nonviolence. And I would have put myself in that camp. There were people like Martin Luther King, who was not a SNCC, but who was obviously part of a movement, who believed in philosophical nonviolence. Probably the leading person in SNCC at that time, who's still around, Congressman John Lewis. He became a preterm chairman of SNCC, was somebody, and who was and still is, basically believed in the philosophical basis of nonviolence.
As well as strategic.
Yeah, as well as strategic, but I'm just making a difference because some of the people who strategic could see some role for what people in Occupy have called diversity of tactics. We never used that term at the time, but it meant that there was something else besides nonviolence that could be allowed, where the people who were pure in terms of nonviolence, that's where it pretty much stayed. We went back and forth on that, and in the later years, in the late 60s, during the Black Power phase, we actually renamed the organization the Student National Coordinating Committee. We wanted to keep the SNCC, but we basically were still having back and forth on that whole question of nonviolence. And many of the people who at that time had been really heavily influenced by the newly liberated countries in Africa and parts of the Third World. We had Che Guevara and folks like that, felt there was a role for what might be called revolutionary violence. You know, we saw the Battle of Algiers movies and things like that, and were in many ways shaped by that. That there were certain places where there might be realm for what might not be, I call it extra legal activity. And I even, at one time, in terms of Occupy Oakland, suggested that might be something they might want to do that was very focused on. Concrete example, was after the Oscar Grant thing. I said that it seemed to me that somebody should go break some windows, and bark, not just helter-skelter around downtown Oakland, but that should be done at a very specific point where people could see that it had a lot to do, or not a lot, everything to do, with how Bart was dealing with the Oscar Grant case. And so that there might be some room for that, but that wouldn't necessarily be your official policy. In the South, though, strategic, tactical nonviolence made total sense. Because when you think about the South in the 50s, it was like apartheid South Africa. And the other side had the laws, they had the police, state police, they had the sheriffs, they had the county highway patrolmen, they had, of course, the white citizens councils, they had the Ku Klux Klan, and through the Congress, they could also use financial power to, in some cases, involve the U.S. military if they felt sufficiently threatened. So there was no real future for a tactic that was not nonviolent in that context. So what we pioneered and was a very militant and aggressive type of agitation, which was nonviolent, which in some ways got defined by a man named Byron Rustin. Byron Rustin was somebody who had worked with Gandhi in India, and got to the London School of Economics. He brought a kind of a world picture to us as basically we were in our 20s in terms of most SNCC people. And he talked about how you could nonviolently basically cause disruption. And very similar to what happened in South Africa in the 70s when the movement there decided to make South Africa ungovernable. They didn't do it militarily, they didn't bring out armies, but basically with the people in motion in the streets, creating through nonviolent activity so much social dislocation. That was the phrase of Byron Rustin. You want to create social dislocation. You want to dislocate basically the powers that be, the forms that be, through a form of what we call political jiu-jitsu. People know what jiu-jitsu is. So you basically use the momentum of the other side to basically overthrow themselves. Perfect example of that, which was not so much a SNCC project, but was Martin Luther King's project, was like in Birmingham, Alabama. When you saw, and this is where you didn't need any type of interpretation, you just turned on your TV, which was an important new invention at the mass level in the 60s, because it allowed people sitting in places like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or California to see this directly. They didn't have to get it filtered through somewhere else. And when they saw water hoses being turned on teenagers, when they saw police dogs, and this was the morality of the other side, of the segregationist side, people could make their own decisions. And they began to see that the moral structure of that order, of law and order, was basically flimsy, but it had to be pushed. And that's what the role of the organizers were to do, to push it, and trying to get the hell out of the way, because when it was coming your way, but sometimes you didn't. And we got put in jail, we got sometimes beat up, and we tried to learn all kinds of self-defense tactics of how to protect yourself, which was important because many of us got trained in nonviolence outside of the South before we went there. Places like in Ohio, Highlander, I think particularly before the biggest project we ever did was the Mississippi Summer Project in 1964. We met in a place, I think it was Hiram, Ohio. Yeah. And we had people, we do exercises of people shouting at people, shoving people, pushing people, bumping people. How do you protect yourself when you're on the ground, and how do you cover up so that at least, it doesn't mean that you don't get hit, but at least that you're able to protect your parts of your body which are the most susceptible to pain and so on. And why that's important, and it's one of the things that I saw very quickly where I loved about Occupy. We had a slogan in the early 60s called putting your body on the line. It wasn't enough just to give a speech, give a talk, even it wasn't enough to do a picket, though we did those things as well. At a certain level, you had to go beyond talk, and you had to be willing to put your whole body on the line. And I was listening to KPFA this morning, actually, and they were talking about the flash mobs. There was this group called Dancing Beyond Borders, and talking about how the effort of dance and the physicality begins to get you in motion, in a very positive motion. Because the other part, which I want to say, which Occupy was back and forth on, is we were beyond just anti. We were basically trying to create alternatives, not just in terms of a small town or a specific place in Mississippi or Alabama, but in terms of how we saw, I mean, before the slogan, be the future that you want to be came about, we were trying to do that through our creation. And we called it the beloved community. That was the slogan that we called it. And so SNCC basically was very much a part of all that. And SNCC was, in some ways, I think, the mother of all movements. I mean, well, put it this way. Civil rights was the mother of all movements in the 60s. But SNCC was by far the sharpest point of that. because it was precisely of this militant, nonviolent action and social change ideology that we were pushing that made sure that this new movement called the Civil Rights Movement was not going to be a legal movement, which it would have been in the 50s and the early 60s, or it would have been at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the urban leadership basically had total hegemony. It's because of young people who basically, you know, just shot. It's like the Dream Students. I mean, I work in immigration now. That's what I do. I work for a group called the Black Alliance for Just Immigration over and only. And we work primarily with African immigrants and Caribbeans, but we work with Latinos and Asians as well. But when I saw the Dream Students putting their body on the line, chaining themselves to senators' offices, I said, hey, that's the spirit of SNCC in today's 21st century. And that kind of energy, because, I mean, I remember being in a kind of intergenerational dialogue, and I was saying, one young woman, I guess she was about 22, she looked at me, she said, yeah, you know, no, I agree with you, but that sounds so tired. And I realized she was right. It was tired. I mean, it's the same thing we've been saying for 20, 30 years. And so what the public wants, and this is why the question of new tactics or ways of doing things, the enthusiasm originally around Occupy, the enthusiasm maybe right now around I Don't Know More, that's happening around the person in Canada with Native people and spreading to the United States, things like the flash mobs. It's basically channelizing rebellious energy in new ways, and we're ahead of the curve. Because at a certain point, the other side, they're not stupid. They learn too. I mean, the first couple of times, they be surprised, overwhelms them. And then they come up with their counterinsurgency tactics and so on, and how to do it, and they're able to put us into a pin. And so part of our job as organizers is got to be the thing we have the most in common up here and our collectivity with each other to basically come up with new ways of posing the struggle, taking the struggle in different directions, but also involving new people. And that was one of the things I was telling the Occupy Open people, is that the point is not to set up a citadel in front of the Oakland City Hall. I mean, it was important to be there because one of the things that Occupy did all over the country was basically, well, they occupied common space, because more and more common space is being privatized and it's really hard to get to. So the fact that Occupy made a tremendous fight to do that was important. But in the long run, we have to be out there in the neighborhoods. I mean, our potential force in Oakland or even in San Francisco is not in downtown in front of the city hall dealing with the politicians. It's basically out in the neighborhoods and getting people to see what Occupy means in different, whether it's around housing, foreclosures, banks, health issues, or whatever issue people choose to work on, that is getting out there and explaining to them. Because if you read the mainstream press, and I think it was Boots Riley, one of the people in Occupy Oakland, who was a hip-hop artist, who said that in every historical struggle, the mainstream press has always been against whatever the insurgency is. So you have to just say, that's one of the things we learn from history. Not that we don't try to talk to the press or some of the better parts of the press or the media, or increasingly now, thanks to the internet, we can do our own media and YouTubes and stuff like that, but by and large, the press is not going to basically be the thing that gets us over. And so we have to basically go out to people and have, I mean, this is where I get really hard. I mean, I would say at least a third of the email I get now are petitions from people to sign something for some decent causes. But that's not organizing anybody. You got to talk to people to organize people. And the fact that you can fill out a bunch of emails and think you've done a whole lot without even hearing the answers is a bunch of crap. And so, I mean, I'm not saying that you go back to the 60s where we didn't have cell phones or computers or all the stuff you guys take for granted today. I'm not saying go backwards, but I'm saying is the most important thing about organizing is people. And having people-to-people relationships, building on those, fighting. That's why the SNCC process has always been talk in small groups, in people's houses, kitchens, have dinner with them, get invited to dinner. Find ways I used to find ways just to pop into people's house around dinner time. And because I had so much information from being over the neighborhood, I was always a welcome guest because I could tell them what their neighbors were up to and stuff like that. And I was eating fried chicken and all that. So, I don't know, I think that's kind of what I wanted to say a little bit. And I guess what kept us going is, I do have two last things to say. What kept us going was each other. I want to say that because I always say, as cocky as I may think I may have been as a young person, I'm much more reserved now, is that I couldn't have done 100 with us if I was alive, in jail. You know, we were talking about music. I mean, a lot of things to say about music, but one of the great things that we did in SNCC was we sang in the jails. Right. So I would be in a jail cell by myself, and I could start singing a song. Paul and Silas bound in jail, and then somebody in the next jail cell who I couldn't even see would pick up the next refrain. And then we'd have the whole jail singing, driving the jailers mad. Get these kids out of here, you know. And so it was both a support thing that when we got frightened, and that's the right word, fright, is that it was a way to embolden us. Or I remember when I was in Cambridge, Maryland, and this was when George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama in 1964, was running for president, and he visited the eastern shore of Maryland, which was by far the most racist part of the state of Maryland. And we were there in Cambridge, Maryland, and we were walking down the street, and we were walking toward the National Guard, and they had dogs, and we were marching just like arm in arm. I was his arm, and I was David here, and we're singing, "We are not afraid." And we're trembling, you know. We're holding each other up, and we're continuing to go forward. That's the main point. We got tear gas, and that was a unique experience in itself, but not to hopefully be relived too often. But the point is you can't let the fear stop you, and you do have fear. So the only way you defeat the fear is with other people with you, and who are able to do the same thing with you and hold you. Because some people, I remember when they got tear gas, my friend, he fell, and I had to pick him up and help him, and with another friend, and drag him out of range of the next projectile that was coming. So the last thing I want to say, since this is the day of Martin Luther King, I want to say something about Dr. King, or as we call them, the Reverend Dr. King, is that Dr. King, and I say this a little bit from hindsight, we had a lot of debates with King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, because we had different styles of organizing. And their style was more to go and talk to the preachers, the already existing leadership of the different towns, and get them all riled up, and maybe have a campaign to the buses or whatever, or maybe to get some people registered to vote. And then when it was all hot, they'd bring in Dr. King from the outside, and he'd give the great speech. And then they'd get lots and lots of people, and then they'd take that mass meeting grouping and confront the mayors or whoever, the city council or the governor in some cases, or like when they marched across the Independence Bridge in Alabama to confront the state legislature in Alabama. So it was basically using the masses in that way. Our thrust was quite different. We started at average people. And we talked to people door to door, knock on doors, and like, what happened here before we got here? We don't think the world began here in X town because some kids from college came from outside the town and started organizing. So we wanted to get, so what's the sense of the history of resistance in your particular town or in your neighborhood? Who were people who stood up, and are they still around, and can we talk to them? Who were people who stood up and got killed, which had happened frequently in places like Mississippi and all that, and make people realize that they were the early heroes. I mean, we were not any braver. I mean, we did some really brave things and some stupid things and all that, but we were not braver than any other people who lived in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s. We had things that are on the side, a little bit of history, the arc of justice that Martin Luther King talked about, but like things like television. We had a complaint where the Cold War was going on in earnest, and here was the United States government trying to fight for the hearts and minds of poor people in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, who were mainly people of color, and they were basically oppressing people of color in their own country. It was a good dynamic to kind of throw at the government, and we did quite frequently. And so previous generations didn't have all that. And so we were able to have the elements to be potentially successful in ways. I mean, as Ruth Silver said, SNCC was not just an organization. SNCC was an organization, but the civil rights was a movement of organizations. I don't totally agree with all the things she said about how the leaders got together. That can be explained. But the main point is that organizations function and movements function different than a particular organization will. And so what we tried to do was have a movement that could be broad. And what Dr. King stood for, and why I think he was the greatest of a period of many great leaders that came out of the 60s, male, female, well-known, not well-known, is that he had space, both in his heart and his vision for everybody. And that included the poor whites in the South and well in the North. It included the people who he disagreed with. I mean, when we came out with Black Power in 1966, most of the mainstream civil rights organizations were ready to throw us into the ocean. And Dr. King didn't agree with us, but he struggled. He said, what is this all about? What are we trying to accomplish here? And people remember during the James Meredith March in Mississippi, he and Stokely Carmichael were having these philosophical discussions about nonviolence and Black Power as they did the action of the day. And so it was important that King represented somebody we could always go to, and that we knew that his heart was open to everybody, and even beyond the civil rights movement. I think I had an insight on this a few years ago, but I realized I really didn't hate George Bush. I thought he was disgusting, the politics was awful, but I really couldn't think I hated George Bush. And that was a real opening for me, because, you don't grow on hate and anger. Anger has its uses, to be sure, at some level, but basically how you approach your outward growth has to be getting people to want to join you because you're coming up with something new, a new way of living, or a new way of relating, a new way of doing politics, a new way of trying to understand and do problem solving. And that's what I think Martin Luther King at his best was about. And I think he personified that better than anybody in U.S. history, and particularly, at least, during the period of the 1960s. So that's what I would say about it. And so I'll stop with that. Right, exactly. The ability, and I think one of the things of greatness in political leadership is the ability to see something of value, even if you disagree with it, on the other side. And another insight I have, maybe people remember this, was the movie that Susan Sarandon did, and Dead Men Walking. I remember how she sat down with people on both sides of the thing. People who wanted to yell and scream, and why are you supporting that murderer? But she had to see that and feel that, and be able to understand what issues were, to be able to even make her own case better. And that's something the movement doesn't do very well. We talk to people basically about ourselves. One of the things I don't like about chants, people spend more time trying to come up with chants that rhyme than trying to do the political discussion of what we're all about. And not that, chants sound nice. I like to be marching on the street with chants, and particularly maybe a drum battery behind us, stuff like that. But at the real level, you have to have chants or slogans or demands that people understand. And we have to sometimes understand people who don't like those stuff. And that they're also part of the public that you have to work with. They're not the end. And as somebody once said, there are a lot of contradictions in the 99%. And if we're going to actually come together in some ways, we have to be able to focus on what are the contradictions against the 1% that will be able to unite not all, but most or a good portion of the 99% movement of progressive direction.
Do we want to have questions with Phil now, or do we want to have David Hartsough speak first and have these questions and answer it together? I'll propose the two options and see, or do you have a preference to take questions?
How are you on time?
Well, we can use the place until 8:45, so we have another hour.
Or 9?
I don't know if, I'll propose the two questions if people prefer to ask questions now, or I'll propose that first, and second, I'll propose having the questions and answers together. So who prefers having questions now go like this? And who prefers having the questions together? Okay. The second option was to have David speak now and have the two of them answer questions together. So seems like that's what.
Go back into the crowd. Huh? Oh, yeah.
And there's water.
This old guy, I've known for ages.
Why don't we take a 10-minute, at least a 5-minute?
5 minutes.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break.
You're going to turn this in.
There's water and
Feel like you
there's
photographed
right
me.
here.
That's what you're doing.
Okay, could we keep the conversation non-existent, please? Thank you. Okay, everybody. So, I'm just going to pretend the conversation has stopped. David Hartsough. Right, I would have pronounced that right if I hadn't been distracted by it. Okay, David Hartsough, in addition to being very helpful to us at Occupy Forum, was involved in the lunch counter sit-ins and the Montgomery bus boycotts, and he's also published a book about his life of activism. All right, introducing David Hartsough.
I think I'm going to call Phil to the temple. If people can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try to speak up a little bit. I think Phil is a good role model for all of us who's been in the struggle for the long haul. And hopefully all of you here that are younger will still be at it, or all of us, regardless of our age, will still be at it when you're in your 70s. Because it's going to be a long haul. So there are a number of things I'd like to say, and I really want to have some time for questions and discussions with both of us also. I had the good fortune of, I was living in Pennsylvania, and Ralph Abernathy, who was Martin Luther King's right-hand man, stayed in our home back in early 1956 during the Montgomery bus boycott. He said ours was the first non-black, non-Negro home that he'd ever slept in. And he said...
Did he get any sleep?
And he said to my dad, he says, why don't you bring the boys down to Montgomery, Alabama, and visit us? So during the spring break in the early '56.
You can use the microphone if you want to.
Yes.
People are having trouble in the back.
Tell me if you can't hear and come up.
Some people are having trouble hearing.
Well, let me try this first.
Okay.
Move up if you have to go.
So my dad took my brother and me down to Montgomery during the Montgomery bus boycott. So at the age of 15, I had a chance to realize the nonviolence in action and the horrendous segregation that was happening in the South. We stopped at Koinonia community in Georgia, which was an interracial community that was hated by the local white racists. And we stayed in their guest house, which is right along the road. And the bed that I slept in had a hole through the wall about this far above where I was sleeping, where a week before the the white racist had shot into the house. And so that kind of brought it home. I guess some people don't like people that are, all people are brothers and sisters and all are lived together people. We went on to Montgomery, and the segregation that was there, for those of us that haven't experienced that firsthand, it was two different worlds. It was like apartheid South Africa, so talking about. And in that very racist, oppressive situation, the blacks found the courage, thanks to the courage of Rosa Parks, to begin boycotting the buses for a very specific goal. It wasn't to challenge all segregation, which they really wanted to do, but we'll start by challenging the segregation of the buses in Montgomery. And for 15 months or so, they refused to ride the buses. And so when we were there, people were walking to work. They set up carpools, but the authorities ruled these illegal, because they didn't have taxi licenses, etc. So people were getting up an hour early every morning and getting home an hour later to not ride the bus. It only cost 10 cents or something like that. But to ride in the back and to ride, without a sense of dignity. I visited a black church that had been bombed very shortly before we got there. And all that was left was a cross that was kind of hanging, with one chain. And the pews were all just in splinters. That was what was left of that church. A local black Baptist church. And the churches, as was mentioned earlier, were a key organizing tool, not just a tool, opportunity in the South to get people that were feeling that oppression to say no and begin working actively to stop it. Well, I was also deeply influenced, so the experience in Montgomery was very important to me. That's where I met Martin Luther King, and he was whatever he was, 29 or so, 28, and I was 15. And I had no idea that he would become, the important person, very crucial person in history, and one of my mentors for the rest of my life. Through the influence of being in Montgomery and through Byron Rustin, who I also got to know since I was a teenager, I decided to go to Howard University, so we have the same alma mater. I'd gone 1 year to Swarthmore College, which was a white college in Pennsylvania, trying to get blacks accepted to be students there, and kind of gave up and thought, well, I ought to be practicing what I preach, so I went to Howard. And it was probably one of the most important decisions of my life, because that was the fall of '59. And in February of '60, as you know, 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina, black students, sat down at a lunch counter and refused to move until they got some food, and they were arrested. That sparked students all across the country saying, we feel the suppression is not just those forces. They had courage, we can have courage. And so that people began sitting in all across the country. And at Howard, we found out that in Washington, D.C. itself, the lunch counters and Woolworths, et cetera, were integrated. But in Maryland and in Virginia, surrounding Washington, everything was segregated. When the African ambassadors drove from New York to Washington, D.C., they could not eat or sleep along Highway 40 in the state of Maryland. So we started on Saturday morning, very soon after the students in Greensboro, going to restaurants and lunch counters in Maryland. And we go to the lunch counter, it'll be closed within 5 minutes. And within another 5-10 minutes, sirens will be coming and we'd be ordered to leave, and some of the kids would be arrested, hauled up to jail. And like Phil was saying, we spent the weekends in jail singing freedom songs and really strengthening our spirits and our courage to keep resisting the segregation. Well, we also explored Virginia, and in Virginia, they had a law that said anybody who challenged segregation there got 6 months in prison and a $500 fine. And so we kept going to Maryland. And you can try to guess why. But the American Nazi Party was in Arlington, Virginia, and threatening to lynch anybody that challenged segregation down there. And when we finished our final exams at Howard, still nobody had challenged segregation in Virginia, and we felt somebody needs to do it. And so we did even more nonviolence training, you know, how we're going to deal with the Nazi Party people and the folks that are really violent, and how we're going to support each other in doing that, did role plays. And some of us actually decided not to go, but 12 of us did. And we went to what's so-called People's Drugstore in Arlington, which you would think would be all people. But when we sat down, they closed the lunch counter and called the police. Police sirens started coming, etc. But the owner of that particular store decided he didn't want to arrest us. He didn't want the publicity, but he also wasn't going to serve us. So we actually stayed there for 2 days, waiting for something to eat or drink. And it was the most challenging 2 days of my life. The Nazi Party did come, you know, with their swastikas and marched behind it, pictures of AIDS because we are Asian people. People put lip cigarettes on our shirts. People punched us in the stomach so hard we would fall on the floor, and then they would kick us, call us everything in the book. And these role plays, you know, how do you try to be nonviolent towards people that are doing this kind of stuff, which is very important in these things. And so we tried to respond in the friendly way as we could, between the tears and the hurt and pain. Toward the end of the second day, a guy came up from behind me and he said, "You nigger lover, if you don't get out of the store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab it through your heart." And in his hand was a switchblade, which by the time I turned around to look at him, his face was contorted with hatred, and his knife was about a half an inch from the heart. And I thought, well, I've got 2 seconds to try to decide what to do. And I just tried to look him in the eyes, and I said, "Well, friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And it was really quite amazing. His jaw began to drop, and this hand, the switchblade began to fall, and he left the store. And which, from the age of 20, really gave me a feeling, well, nonviolence maybe is not just, you know, morally right. Maybe it's the most effective thing that we could do in that kind of situation. Well, then we did something even harder. There's about 500 people outside the People's Drugstore in Arlington, Virginia, which is just across the river from Washington. And it had been in the front pages of the Northern Virginia Sun, so 500 people out there with stones and rocks. And we went to the front door and we read an appeal to the religious and community leaders of Arlington to use their influence to try to get the facilities open to everyone. And we said, if nothing changes, we'll be back in a week. And that's what was very hard. but we'll be back in a week. And some friendly media people got us out. The car was right outside the door and got us out there alive. And we got back to Washington and literally shook for 6 days whether we had the courage to go back and do this again. And on the 6th day, we had a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met, and they talked with the business leaders, and the People's Drugstore and other lunch counters were open. And it was one of the happiest moments of my life. And really taught me the most important lesson that I learned in school, in university, in graduate school, and life since, is we don't have to just sit and curse, the darkness, curse the oppression, the violence, the wars. Even a few people with some courage and a commitment to nonviolence can really help bring about real change. We can make history. And so that's one of the reasons I feel the Occupy movement is the most exciting thing that's happened since this century. And so I'm grateful to all of you for your participation. Well, at the same time as Greensboro was happening, or even before that, Jim Lawson, who's an African-American pastor, was training the students in Nashville in nonviolence. And not just kind of a 2-hour training or a half-hour training or a 6-hour training. They did training for months. And for those of you that haven't seen it, the first story, and it's of course more powerful, is that nonviolent training that they did. And those students that he trained not only were absolutely crucial in the whole civil rights movement, but they have been lifelong actors. And people like John Lewis, who's now in Congress, and Darwin Nash, and Bernard Lafayette, etc. They've been keeping at it with every ounce of their energy. And what you didn't hear about the Freedom Ride, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, organized that. But after the bus was taken, they called it off. They said, this is just too dangerous. We can't be responsible for continuing this on into the Deep South. That was just across the border in Alabama. They hadn't gotten to Montgomery or to Mississippi. And so these students in Nashville heard about this and says, we cannot allow that to happen. We have to continue the Freedom Ride. And so they wrote their wills. These were 20-year-olds. They wrote their wills, got on the bus, went down to wherever it was, Montgomery, and boarded the bus to continue on to Mississippi. Well, because they said, if we allow this violence to stop us, this is the lesson that all the racists in the South have been learning. Just use a little violence against these folks and they'll quit. And that's not who we are. And so anyway, I think those students at that moment, but also in the rest of their lives, have been serving that kind of courage that's been very, very important. I just want to share a couple stories about how Martin Luther King tried to help bring about change. One of the stories that I think is particularly important, and I think several of you've already heard, is the suggestion that Occupy focus, that when you try to get everything, people think, what? So they were, after they'd gotten the Civil Rights Bill, still blacks could not vote in the South. So on the way home from getting the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway, King stopped by the White House to talk with Lyndon Johnson about we need a voting rights bill. And Johnson said, we just got the Civil Rights Bill, and Congress has never passed this. And wait a few years and then we can introduce it. King didn't waste one moment in Washington. He went south, and together with the Smith people and many others, organized the voting rights campaign, where African Americans just went to the local courthouse to try to vote. And they got beaten up, and pushed down the stairs, and, police dogs, etc. This got on national television. And the American people across the country saw this is the inhumanity that the system of segregation is doing to black Americans throughout this country. And literally within several months, we had a voting rights bill. So that was kicking, and that's the way the civil rights movement was working. I mean, there was Montgomery, Alabama, that was working on segregation of buses in one city. There was voting rights. There was jobs. There was the public facilities, movies, movie theaters, parks, etc. So they take one of these things at a time and get people organizing active nonviolent resistance to stop that. And they were very astute at using media. They would pick places where there was the most oppressive power structure, sheriffs, mayors, etc., and go there to do their action, knowing that when the American people saw totally nonviolent people faced with this kind of ruthless violence from the authorities, it would arouse their conscience and their hearts, and they would get actively involved, which they wouldn't if something didn't happen. Well, people have already talked about how music nourished the souls and the spirits of people, and in the black churches across the country, there were often mass meetings, which were like pep rallies, where not only the activists, but all the people that vaguely felt supportive of this came to hear what was going on, and sing songs and hear speakers, and got energized to join the movement. So that was just absolutely crucial. I think that, Phil was also talking about this, but I think they reached out to potential allies. I mean, realizing that only a broad-based movement is really going to change this country, as long as it's a tiny percentage of the people that are trying to change things. And it was a tiny percentage that were actually doing civil disobedience and challenging the law, but it was with the support of a much broader community of people. And those mass meetings and the singing and the going to jail together also built a tremendous sense of community. And what we were facing in Arlington, Virginia, was we could not have done this if we were the only students doing it. It was the fact that students all over the South were challenging these laws, were going to jail, were getting beaten up, and still persisted. It gave us courage. We're part of a group of people that are going to help make history and really change, challenge the whole segregation system in the country. I think the whole idea of sustained nonviolent resistance is really crucial. I mean, in the United States, I think we have that instant mentality. You push the button on the microwave and 60 seconds later it's all done. And I think if we look at the people's history of the United States, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, etc., none of this has happened overnight. It's been through sustained struggle. And the Occupy movement, in a sense, are trying to do something even larger. And so to think we can do this in 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, I mean, it's going to be a lifetime of struggle. And hopefully we can learn some lessons from the civil rights movement and from others that have gone before it. was very hopeful that, and SNCC actually took the lead on this even before Martin Luther King did, of making the connection between the Vietnam War and the whole military system that was gobbling all the resources. So there was no money left, for the war on poverty that John promoted in that period. And it's the same now. If we hadn't spent over $1 trillion a year, it's what we're spending now, over $1 trillion a year to fight these wars and nuclear weapons development, military bases all over the world, drones, et cetera. We'd have plenty of money. We wouldn't have to be making any of these budget cuts in schools and parks, and daycare, food stamps, whatever. But the people have to demand. I don't understand. Almost all the people in this country are hurting as a result of these cuts, 99%. And yet people are sitting at home and say, oh, gee whiz, this is very terrible. And so, like the folks in civil rights movement, we've got to find, the point where that is very, very clear. Go out and dramatize that, wake people up and say, get out of your slumber and join us. And so anyway, I think when King made that connection between the Vietnam War and the work for civil rights and freedom in this country, it was very crucial. And even though he got criticized by the establishment and even many people in the movement, he felt morally compelled to speak out on this issue. Well, I was also involved in King's last campaign, which was the Poor People's Campaign. How many people know about the Poor People's Campaign? Oh, good. Well, this was King felt by the time the end of his life, it wasn't just the segregation. It was the horrendous economic injustice in our society that was the problem, and felt we had to develop a campaign to really address that. And so he invited, poor farm workers, poor sharecroppers from the South, people from inner cities across the country, et cetera, to come to Washington and essentially say, business as usual has to stop in Washington D.C. if we don't really address the whole question of poverty. Unfortunately, he was shot and killed before that campaign could actually begin. And so when it did begin,
Not a coincidence.
it wasn't a coincidence. And he was shot 1 year to the day after he made the speech against the Vietnam War, which is also not an accident. But, so I was involved both in the nonviolent training and building the shanties at the Poor People's Campaign. And I think that is a model for what Occupy movement folks could do. If first we have to do the homework. Like Phil was saying, build the connections with all the people that are hurting as a result of this economic system, and get them really vitally involved, as allies and co-conspirators, co-workers. And then, maybe we need to start with something smaller than Washington, D.C., but that's the same idea. So I think the Poor People's Campaign has the seed of a lot of lessons for what we could be doing in the Occupy movement. 500 of the Occupy, of the Poor People's Campaign actually marched with their bill of an economic bill of rights to Congress and were arrested at the edge of the Capitol grounds. So a bunch of us Quakers, when we heard about this, we decided to go and have a Quaker meeting for worship right at the place they'd been arrested, and then take that bill of rights up to Congress, and then we were arrested. So we actually got to, and I call it a privilege, got to spend 2 weeks in jail on the top floor of the Washington, D.C. jail with these 500 people from all around the country that have come to say, things have to change, and we're willing to put our lives on the line to help see that happen. There's no fans or air conditioning on the top floor of the jail in the summer. So, you know, the conditions were not ideal, let's put it that way. So what are some of the lessons? And I'll just try to go through some of these quickly so we have some time for discussion. One, I think the commitment to nonviolence is really crucial. I think, as I said before, I think that the country seeing the contrast between the violence of the system and the nonviolence of people trying to change that system was crucial in touching the heart and the conscience and getting them involved and supporting them. And this is from the Fellowship for Reconciliation, but this is some nonviolent guidelines. These aren't exactly what was used in the civil rights movement, but it's very similar. I think the understanding of the importance of a broad-based movement to reach out to potential allies and involve them. I think in the Occupy movement, we have not been as strong on getting out and talking to people in the grassroots. And one of the issues that really concern them and build campaigns around that. I think the whole issue of realizable goals. As I said, in civil rights, it was bus segregation, it was jobs, it was voting rights, etc. And within the larger thing that we want to do of transforming this whole society into a real just and democratic society, pick parts of that if we really put our shoulder to the plow, we have a chance of changing. And such as I think the foreclosure thing. I mean, that, I think we could win it. If we all got involved in that whole thing. I think we were willing to accept consequences, and even jail or getting beaten up, without saying, well, we've got to get back at these people. And so, in places like Birmingham, they filled the jails. And after all the older folks that were willing to go to jail, still things hadn't changed, then the children decided they wanted to join. And so you had thousands of young people, kids from the school, also filling the jail. 10? Well, I think.
I want freedom.
I think the whole question of leadership, Bill talked briefly about this, but I think there's been a sense of anybody that's a leader, we're going to shoot them down. And personally, I think all of us need to be leaders. And we need to nurture people taking leadership. The amount of work that has to be done on the community level to build the kind of movement we're talking about, we need to support and encourage people to take leadership rather than shooting them down. And that's not to say we should have a dictator who sets everything up. And I think what's been happening in the San Francisco Occupy Forum is an example of what could be done. Rather than trying to make all the decisions by everybody, have people in kind of action groups for taking on specific projects, campaigns, and have representatives of those people getting together weekly to try to make decisions. That kind of thing makes a lot more sense than spending all day and all night trying to make decisions, which I found, especially when I was a young father, it discriminated against anybody that had kids. Because if you can't stay there all night to have a meeting, you're out of the decision-making process. And that's not democratic or fair or anything else. I think I already said, but the need for sustained struggle is absolutely crucial. So we need to build a movement that is in it for the long haul. This is not just from civil rights movements, but I think affinity groups or small groups that will support each other, taking on a particular project, helping stay nonviolent in the face of violence, etc., is very important. I think the thing which the civil rights movement did, especially Smith and King, making the connection between Occupy and the kind of things we're concerned about, and the whole military-industrial complex, which is really kind of, rolling the roost. And that's where the money is. And that's also where, a lot of the 1% are making billions of dollars off of these wars. I mean, they're about the only people that are benefiting. But we need to make that connection. And that would bring the pieces much more together with the Occupy movement. There are Chris Hedges, who probably many of you have heard or read, is saying only massive nonviolent civil disobedience. And that's the only hope for really bringing about change, the kind of transformation that we need in this society. And I agree with him much more than I agree with Ruth Silver, although I certainly appreciate the positive things that she's done on the city council and et cetera. But I think we have to be prepared to get out there and face the fire hoses, and the bullet clubs, and things like Davis, the tear gas, and all of that stuff, and jail, and longer term jail. My wife and I are facing possible 6 months in jail just for protesting the drones up in Beale Airport Base. I mean, there's nicer things to do than sit around in jail for 6 months, but if that's what it's going to do. But that's what it's going to take, and this man has spent years in jail. So we need to be inspired by what's gone before us. And I think things like The Support's More Powerful. There's a film called Soundtrack for a Revolution, which is about the music which brought together, or which was the kind of what connected various parts of the civil rights movement. There's Eyes on the Fives, if you haven't seen that, which is the history of the civil rights movement. I mean, most of these I think are available in the library. And I bought copies of this and some copies of this is three of King's speeches, sermons, Loving Your Enemies, Letter from Birmingham Jail, a Declaration of Independence from the War in Vietnam. I also brought B. Schofield, who some of you may know, made this CD of all of King's most radical stuff, challenging the economic injustice, the power structure, etc., racism. And I've got some of those back there. And for those of you that don't know about it, Maria Stefan and Erica Chenoweth, and she met with some of us here in Washington. The two of them did a study of violent and nonviolent struggles over the last 110 years, and found that the nonviolent struggles were twice as likely to be successful. And that's, moral principles aside, this is what was successful, and not only in creating a change, but in helping see that after we brought about the change, we didn't have a return to dictatorship or a civil war. So anyway, there's this issue of street spirit has a summary of an interview with her about that. And then some of you, or many of you hopefully, were part of the workshop that Hartsough did. And this issue of Street Spirit, which is just the December issue, has a long, in-depth interview with Hartsough about the positive peace warrior training that he's been doing. But anyway, so these are back in the, well, I'll just pass these out. But, so there are resources to kind of inspire us and things that we can learn from. And Phil and I think we'd both love to answer any questions or...
Yes, can I give that as one new resource? I don't know if people have heard of Caleb Branch.
Yeah.
He's a historian who's written 3 books on the King years. His first one was called Finding Waters, and one was Blitz Prize or whatever. He has a new book, which was in the big section yesterday, the Chronicle. And it's called The King Years, but Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement. And why that's so important is because it's only $20 and it's only 200 pages. And so, I know this generation is not the most reading generation, but so you can hold it to give or share with other people. This was a yesterday's paper. Taylor Branch is really a dynamic writer, and you will have to be there with where he wrote. This is a version of the haiku.
Okay.
Which paper was that in?
San Francisco Chronicle yesterday.
So questions, comments?
Right.
Yeah, so.
Questions, comments, and discussion until about quarter of, and we do have a few announcements tonight after.
Yeah, wish we had more time, but we don't, but maybe you should both be up
Yeah,
there.
please.
Come on, Joe.
Louis too, you should be up there.
Yeah, and this is Louis Vitale, whom we would have put on the panel, except we thought he would be in New York.
Yeah, you should take a question too.
Okay, as you like, but he was there too, so, all right, there they are. Well, there's so many things I could ask, but one of the things you both mentioned was the role of the new medium of television in getting the word out about this movement, and the media has become so much more sophisticated at discrediting movements now. How can we either manipulate them more skillfully or figure out ways that don't end on them? I'm wondering.
I don't know, I would just say historically, the major critique we always had was that the sensationalism is still around, and that there was very little context. So they'd always pick out something provocative or picturesque, put it in the paper, you'd see it, and it usually would be set up in a way that would kind of put down the movement, or the movement had to spend the next 5 days explaining what was on page 1. And there was very little context. That's still relatively true. And what has in some ways helped is that thanks to the internet and blogs, as people are beginning to do their own content.
I guess I would say, I mean, it's great that we can have our own media now, but I think when you had something like the students at Davis, you know, who were just sitting, you know, demanding that the university do whatever, divest or whatever, and the police came and, you know, just tear gassed in their eyes and up their nose, etc., and they remained nonviolent. Well, that got on the TV news, you know, and it went viral all around the world. Well, I think when Scott Olson, you know, Vietnam or not, Iraq War veteran, you know, was a part of a peaceful demonstration and got, you know, almost killed, you know, by the Oakland police. I mean, that was a very big story, and I think woke up a lot of people and got a lot of allies for the movement. And my own feeling is the senseless breaking of windows, etc., is what lost us a whole lot of the sympathy and support and involvement of, you know, the ordinary people in Oakland that are our natural allies. And so I think having the discipline, you know, and courage and commitment of Scott Olson and the students in Davis, etc., is what's needed. And if we do it well, like I think, you know, the civil rights movement, they did it very well, I mean, I think we will get publicity. And I think part of the story is also to design our actions so if a picture is taken, and maybe it's partly the banners or partly flyers, etc., people get the message just by seeing the picture. You know, they can write in whatever they want to, but they will understand. Yeah.
I have a question about militancy and nonviolence. Why are they seemingly in public perspective exclusive? And why does militancy tend to be manifested by breaking the window? Why? How can that change?
Well, I think, as I said, the media that tends to promote this has a very much of a purpose in what they're trying to do, regardless of the movement, whether it's women burning their bras back in the 60s or what. You know, it's always negative to the people who are doing it. And so you have to start out with that and basically see that is what it is and do your education accordingly and as thoroughly as you can and come up with common medium. I do want to say one thing about the whole militance, aggressiveness, nonviolence. It's really a part of U.S. culture, and so I'm not sure how much we're going to change it. We can challenge it constantly, but I think that until we have some degree of victory, and I'm not even sure what that means really, is that it's going to be there. And so that's it's like all these little games you see. If you turn on TV, there's more violence on TV. Yeah, all over. I mean, and our games, the different video games. What are they about? People fighting. I grew up reading comic books. It used to be about Archie and Jughead and all that. Now you go into any comic book store, practically 95% have these people and very metallic things, but they're fighting. And that's part of the psyche that they draw. And then they have some from Japan with the manga and stuff, and even, but it's not Japan per se. I mean, they do that too. But it's like, it's very part of the U.S. And I would say, given where we are, it's probably frontier in town, in terms of the West, places like Arizona. So actually, there's a lot of these reactionist laws come up in Arizona and part of Texas and so on. So I think that's part of it. So I think that we're given with the challenges, we fight it, but I'm not sure we're going to actually win that.
Well, I guess I would say we have to change the definition of nonviolence. Yeah, nonviolent is not being violent. It is assertive, it is out there. It's the ultimate nonviolence. Dave Dellinger was 7 years in prison. One more power than they do, but talked about this is what we really need. It's very assertive, militant nonviolence, not kind of sitting around.
Let me add something to that. Probably one of the oldest in the room here.
The teacher's of course on Gandhi at San Francisco State
For many years. Your question, both Gandhi and King at different times addressed the question you asked, if I understood it, I hope. Why is it that nonviolence is sometimes equated with passivity, or passive resistance? And Gandhi and King in their own times said pretty much the same thing. Our species, to be species-centered for a minute, just talk about humans, for most of our experience, has had a choice of either acquiescence and capitulation, or by God will die fighting. And so the proposition there is that there's such a thing as nonviolent power, nonviolent force. Part of the confusion, I'm a recidivistic academic here, part of the confusion on the Christian side of things was this resist not evil in the Sermon on the Mount, which was Tolstoy's text, and resist not evil seems to be a call for acquiescence. But in the full context, and given what both Gandhi and King were saying, there's something other than capitulation or violence, namely nonviolent, forceful action. And in fact, Gandhi, just to wrap up the mini lecture, Gandhi had 2 words. One was satyagraha, holding on to truth force, self-suffering, nonviolent action. And the other was duragraha, holding on to hatred. And that would be passive resistance. You're passive so long as you think you're outgunned, but you still harbor hate, and you're waiting for the chance to take up the arms. So I think if I'm not capitalizing on your question, I think nonviolent force is what we're talking about. Highly organized, effectual, sustained, all the rest of it.
I want to say one thing, and I don't want hard to say for this there about 5 minutes left. I just want to open up a new idea. Because it's something we saw repeatedly in the South. And that is what I would call, and it's a fancy word here for some people, the dialectical relationship between nonviolence and potential violence. And what I mean by dialectical is that you have two opposite things, violence and potential violence, but they're connected and sometimes work together. 2 examples of that which are relatively brief. One were that the people who came down to the South frequently stayed in the home of people who lived there, usually poor peasants, African American folks who were farmers and so on. These were people who went day by day and worked nonviolently, and that was their focus, to work nonviolently. However, those homes that they stayed in had guns in them, basically by people who lived there, who were hunters, but who also used those guns against raids of the Ku Klux Klan, who came to burn their churches and burn their houses. The Klan knew those guns were there. And so, in some ways, the safety of those students to be outsiders, agitators, freedom riders, whatever names you want to call them, to be safe in the middle of rural Mississippi was based on the fact that there were people, they stayed in housing where people had guns who knew how to use them if they had to use them. So I just want to say that. Another example of the same dynamic, also in the South, but I see it outside the South, were actual demonstrations on the street. Where on these demonstrations you have basically young people and a lot of women who were basically marching and leading and registering to vote. Standing along the side, on the sidelines, or some hidden from view, were black men. And they were not marching. They were just watching. And the police also knew they were watching. And they also knew that these black men who were on the sideline could not be counted to be nonviolent if they saw their wives, their children being beaten up and harassed by the cops. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but I'm saying that it's like, what are all the factors that go into these propositions? And so a lot of the ability for these people to move safely in a march in places like, again, small towns, particularly Alabama, Mississippi, I was more in Mississippi than Alabama, is their safety was based on the fact that there were people around who were not committed to necessarily being nonviolent, and the forces that be, i.e. the police, knew that. So, I just use those 2 examples to say that this is a little bit more complex, and I just want to raise it. I'm not saying that anybody should jump out and have guns in their house or that, but I'm saying that those elements exist in every city in the country, here in the north as well as the south. So,
I appreciate your perspective, but I think that if people had used those guns to try to protect the people in the house, we would have had civil war.
Yeah.
And you would have had massive bloodshed, and you know who would be the ones that would get most shot up? And it would be us, and it would be the blacks. Because the poor have maybe a hunting rifle or whatever in that house, but the Klan and the police have hundreds of guns, thousands, and so I think to challenge them on their ground, which is what you do with a gun, challenge them with a gun, especially if you ever have to use it, is a losing proposition. And so
that's why I say
my feeling is that it was the commitment of the people to stay nonviolent, even in the face of all the violent affections, is really what won the battle. It wasn't, the sometimes guns that people had. So I just want to say 2 other things. before our time is
Can I
up.
cut in, we do have, this is Caroline from Global Exchange, and thanks to her.
Here's the director. Quickly down and not to use a brush. So just two other things I just want to say. One was taking one issue at a time, like voting bus segregation federation. If you win that, people have a tremendous sense of achievement. We can actually make change. It's not just sitting out there with a sign and for the next 55 years and saying, curse the darkness, or whatever. So I think that's certainly it was an important lesson that we can learn from the civil rights movement. The other I wanted to mention is that George Blakey, who was training the students that went to Mississippi Summer at Hiram University in Ohio, and I'm also from Ohio, is going to be out here at the end of this month. And is one of the best strategists in the world, I think. And we're going to be, a group of us are going to be kind of talking, strategizing. Unfortunately, it's not here on a Monday night, but on Thursday afternoon, the 31st of January, at 1:30, I still have to finalize, but it will probably be at the Quaker Meeting House, 65 Ninth Street. But anyway, so people that are really interested in strategy and looking at powerful nonviolent action as opposed to a wishy-washy stuff, I was going to invite you to come and be part of that. How was that? It's January 31st. It's a Thursday afternoon at 1:30. At the Quaker Meeting House at the 65 Ninth Street. And I'll get the word out. If it's not there. I think it's going to be.
Just a question to you. I was wondering if you could be like a horse whisperer, maybe about all the Oakland GAs.
They got two parents for me too.
No, what decisions would you stick with and what would you change? What do you think Occupy Oakland did well and what maybe could have gone differently?
I think what they did well is that they basically publicly represented the diversity that was pretty much present anywhere in the movement. Not just the Occupy movement, but the movement in general. I think that they had the open grip to basically tackle the tough issues and move forward, whether it was even their infamous fuck the police, marching every Friday, but they were not afraid to be polite, and they didn't give a meeting. Sometimes a little too excessive on that, a little stubborn, but I think that was important, and that's to push forward. And I think that probably they were very creative in thinking of ways to, when they were doing it, is to make coalitions, particularly with labor. They did that around sports, or they did it around strikes. They were able to help labor unions who had contract negotiations which didn't allow them to do certain things that the Occupy people could do and help out the labor cause. They also had a view of the city, which got a little bit, they got a little too much stuff in the police. I thought one of the things I kept saying, stay on message. The message is around the 1%, and that's the attraction that the whole national movement has involved the local. And the police can be awful, and open and allow examples of that, and they should respond to that. Shouldn't even mean focus. The thing, and I remember the Black Panthers, the people older, I remember they had a 10-point program. The main one, the one you heard about most of the time, was something number 7, and you didn't hear about that until other than so some kind of I think it's their best. I mean, they look at some of the young people, some older people, some consistent church people, religious people, and down there. The Teamsters came and dropped off wire. These big tubs of wire on the back of their trucks. And of course, they 9 people come down. They had, I think, 3 people who'd been kidnapped in Iran. And when they were free, they came there. Michael Moore came there. And so, I mean, it was like the university, or a lot of things beyond just Oakland. And so I think that was what they did do. Since I'm running my mouth, let me just say one last thing, which is not occupied, but I mean, I said I worked on immigration before. And one of the things that immigration has really shown to me is that this country is not the solution but the problem. And I said that particularly in view of this discussion we're having today. Because, I said this country is not the solution, it is the problem. And I say that particularly in terms of this because what I learned in the civil rights movement and what we did primarily is to try to bring in the government, the national government, to enforce its own laws or renew laws against these bad governors or police forces or inadequate, outdated, archaic Jim Crow laws. And so the government, reluctantly to be sure, many times, had to be pulled in, but they were basically the answer. And you see immigration, particularly what's happened in this country in the last 30 to 40 years, where the jobs have gone. And also what's happened in terms of a lot of those countries which have been gutted out, and they have no place to go but here. So-called the push-pull of immigration. You see that, once you see that, you begin to see that on a lot of other issues as well. And so, I mean, I think that Occupy, or the U.S. movement in general, have to see themselves as citizens of the world and begin to take that responsibility up in terms of our demands, in terms of our focus, and that military budget. That, I mean, we used to have the slogan, the major domestic problem in this country is our foreign policy. Because, like David said, it takes all the money, potential money, away from the domestic. And it's made the country fighting deficits, cutbacks, giveaways for the people who are at the bottom. And, or even increasingly, which is the middle. I mean, I do a lot of talks at high schools, community colleges, and I talk to a lot of black and Latino and young white kids, and saying to them that the statistics for your generation are not very good. I mean, there's statistics that show that the age range for white women has gone down in the last 10 years. This is not black women.
Their lifespan?
Lifespan, yeah, has decreased in the last 10 years. I hate to point out anybody, but like this young lady right here, I say, I'm talking about usually blacks and Latinos and poor Asians. I say, the stats for white people in this country is that you are not going to live as well as your parents' generation. You're going to be the first generation in U.S. history not to be able to have the potential wealth, the jobs, the house, right. And so it's not just a racial issue. It has racial aspects to it, to be sure, but that everybody is in this together. And the challenges, I mean, it's like the Hopi Elderly always talk about this as the 11th hour. I mean, it increasingly is getting to be that point where, I mean, right now we're talking about cutting the entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and constant deficits, and our governor, finally we get a Democratic majority in the state on both sides, and wants to keep the status quo and not move forward.
The Trust Act.
Yeah.
He wouldn't sign the Trust Act. Clubhouse did it to save the people being deported.
Exactly.
And he wouldn't sign it. We went up to the legislature, we went up to the old folks, we went up to
right, exactly. So I guess the point is that, as Ruth Silver said, the 60s was easier in the sense that there was one major focus. And even right after that, was the Vietnam War. Now there are so many issues. One of the challenges of Occupy and the movement as a whole is to focus on certain specific things they can do, but also at the same time still keep the broader picture. What is happening in this world? What is the role and responsibility of U.S. citizens in this country in relationship to people in the world? And because our country is all over the world, there's awful things everywhere, and it doesn't get challenged for the most part. The big challenge is the 600 and some military bases we have around the country, around the world. There's more countries than there are in the world. And we have all these military bases that come out of U.S. taxpayer money. Never issue a political campaign. And that's where I don't think that's the way. And
Yes.
Well, this is wonderful. Thank you.
Stand up, would you?
No, stand up for the seat.
Wonderful. Thank you for putting this on. I have a resource and comment. The resource, you were mentioning some earlier, that I think illuminates the fact that when we talk about tiny resources, when we talk about the movements of the past, it's of necessity summarized and simplified and cleaned up. I mean, you know, it was just as messy. It was just as messy. You know, the discussions were just as hostile sometimes. You know, people said terrible things by accident and on purpose sometimes. You know, and it wasn't clear, you know, who was, you know, who had the right perspective for the future. And sometimes it wasn't even clear after we did it. Only years later is it clear that, well, you know, maybe what we were fighting about wasn't the important points. We were both wrong about the most important points. How many times have I come to that conclusion in you know, 40 years of doing this stuff? But one resource that exhibits that very well, very rare in movies and books and stuff, that really gets demonstrated in not a, you know, grinding one's own axe kind of way, is a wonderful movie about King's Last Days. Only it's not about King's Last Days. They're in it. It's about the struggle of the sanitation workers in Memphis, called River Eye Station.